Hey there! Welcome to Culture by Culture, a multidimensional exploration of Black and Asian pop cultural ties. I'm your former high school journalist host, Delia, and today is the final episode of our Coalition miniseries. Joining me today, I'm so excited, are the co-editors of the Black Allyship at Mochi column for Mochi Mag, Editor-in-Chief Giannina Ong, and Editor Sarah Park. Yay! Hi, y'all!
Hi. Thank you for having us.
I'm so excited to have y'all. Could you please go ahead and tell the listeners a little bit about yourselves and what y'all do?
Well, I'm Giannina. I am editor-in-chief at Mochi Mag, as you have mentioned. It is definitely a passion project. Mochi Mag is the longest running digital publication for and by Asian American women. We're all volunteers, so we work really hard to produce the content that we're producing. And we just hope to get the word out there about, what it means to be Asian American and what we should keep our consciousness open to, I think, especially when it comes to, living in this country. So I think that that's my gist, but I will pass to Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I am one of the editors at Mochi Mag, and by day, I work in tech. As Giannina mentioned, we are all volunteers. Mochi is our passion project, and by night, I do freelance writing and editing. A little bit about me. I am born and raised in New York, and it's this beautiful multicultural place, of course, with its own social and political issues. But I think that has always set the tone for how I approach cross-cultural, cross-racial solidarity and just working together towards a common goal.
Very cool. I am so surprised to hear you both say that this is kind of a side project. I mean, I'm not trying to diminish it. It's just that when you go to Mochi Mag, it's so... what's the word? I think it's very polished. Y'all turn out content like what I would think a full-time digital publication would. I would not know that y'all are doing this after hours as a hobby or a passion project in your real lives, that y'all have big jobs and all that stuff. That's very, very impressive to me. So I just want to give you your flowers there. That's awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, it's a passion project in that I put so much of myself into it, So
right.
Hearing that, it just makes my heart flutter. But also it's like, hey, anybody listening, pay us for it.
Yes,
we would
please.
love to get paid.
I would love for y'all to get paid. So if y'all are listening and y'all want to drop a few coins, please. They do fantastic work, which is why they're here today, because part of that work involves their column, Black Allyship at Mochi. I found this column, I think just in research in general, when I was prepping for the podcast. I didn't really realize it was a whole column. I wish I could remember what specific article I had seen, but I had bookmarked it and was like, oh, this is a cool article. I'm going to come back to this. And then at some point later on, I realized, oh, wow, this is a whole column they're doing. This is a continuous column and thing that y'all are pursuing, which I think is very cool. So I wanted to start with, I guess, tell the people what Black Allyship at Mochi is in y'all's terms and what was a catalyst for creating it.
Yeah. I mean, Black Allyship at Mochi, which we internally call BAM.
I have been abbreviating it, not knowing that BAM. So that's good to know.
We call it BAM internally, is an ongoing project for us, right? It's really important that it's ongoing. And I think it's important that we don't position ourselves as experts, right? We are really trying to forge solidarity between Asian Americans, particularly our readers, and, the Black community in the fight for racial justice, because our fates are so intertwined. And if we don't work together in solidarity for one another and next to one another, then I think that we cause more harm than good. So I think it's like our little, just like an endless struggle that we're in. I feel like, I don't want to say that it's something that we do as an expert at all, right? I think, for instance, we did post about Juneteenth, which was just a little bit ago. And as I was rereading our archival article, we use the term slaves. However, we know that, nowadays it's really inhumane to call people slaves. The proper term that people have been telling us that they want to be called, or they want their ancestors to be called, are enslaved people, enslaved Black people. So I think that even in our column, although we want to educate our community, we are aware of the position that we're in and that we're still learning and growing. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. And to add on to that, I think especially coming from our communities, which are constantly and very much intentionally designed by the white supremacy that's,
Yeah.
that we are pitted against each other in this narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is something that we are, aware of and that we want to address and help educate our own communities, because that's really where it starts. That responsibility does fall on us, and that emotional labor should not fall on Black people. And I think that is something that we really stress, gathering resources for our communities, stressing specific action items for, our readers, and not just being this performative ally, and instead really trying to educate ourselves, and our community members. Something that we're also very aware of is that, as you can see, we're both East Asian, and that in itself is also a very limited perspective. So things that we're constantly learning and constantly trying to work on within ourselves.
I totally feel that on the flip side of moving in a way of wanting to like support these communities, be a good ally, but also I'm not an expert. So like acknowledging and just knowing that I'm going to get stuff wrong. But I think a lot of people get stuck in the like minutia of being scared to get it wrong. And I think there is a responsibility of doing your best and always having the best intentions and going forward with listening the best information you can put out that you have at the time. But I think the most important thing is just to get out there and try, because imagining a world where, oh, what if we get this wrong? What if we say this wrong because we're not experts would mean that, the column wouldn't exist, because you have to start somewhere, right? So I think it's very cool that you can look back on your work and see the growth that you as an organization have made. But also, I still think I saw the Juneteenth post, which I think originally is from 2020, possibly, that y'all reposted. And it was a really good post. And I think it's really needed because these conversations across our communities don't really happen a lot. I'm curious, though, you are wanting to curate these conversations for both of our communities to come together, especially because, like Sarah pointed out, white supremacy is always at work trying to pit us against each other. I'm wondering what the community response has been to the column.
I think that community response has been great. We've met lots of people who believe the same things that we believe, which I think sometimes you feel like, oh, you're preaching to the choir, but it's nice to hear that there is people out there who are doing the same work. And I think, you recently talked to Rohan Zhao Li, and they are a great friend of Mochi. So I think like connections like that have been wonderful, and, really figuring out like, how can we foster those connections? How can we, work together in coalition? How can we, build this movement further, right? I think that there's that end for me, because I have a master's in women's and gender studies, and it was really focused on, ethnic studies, really, because it's at the intersection of like gender and race and all these things. And for me, I've like had this like in me, this activist movement in me, like, how can we further this? But I think that there's also the part to what we're trying to do in that we're called Black allyship and not Black co-conspirators or something like more progressive, because we know where some of our readers are at, right? And I think that because we know where some of our readers are at, we meet them where they're at. And I think that they appreciate that. So we've heard that, like, it's really great to see that you're helping us talk to our parents about these topics. It's really great to see that you're providing perspectives on, what's going on right now, especially during like the George Floyd protests, right? So I think for me, it's like both ends, right? Like, it's like, yeah, be an activist and move things forward, but also don't leave people behind.
And to add on to that, something that we heard back, not necessarily as feedback, but just a comment from someone who had followed Mochi from when it first started. And they had mentioned that, Mochi's getting really political. And I really sat with that comment and thought, is that a bad thing? Maybe we're not connecting with certain audiences. And I thought about it, and, we talked about it, Giannina, and we really decided, you know what? That's what it is to be an Asian American person and any kind of marginalized person, because our act of being is political. And we decided to just really lean into that and say, like, yes, we can have fun, of course, and we can, publish these fun pieces that maybe are an easier read, but at the same time, we want to be a much more socially aware and active community.
That's so funny that you share that, because I think it was not far into my tenure as editor-in-chief that we got that comment. They're like, I was like, oh, it's like Giannina's doing this. Giannina's driving this. And I was like, the term Asian Americans wouldn't come to be if it wasn't for politics, for the need to stand together politically beside Black and brown students who were organizing. So for me, it's like, how can you say you're an Asian American magazine and not touch on anything that's political? Like that doesn't make any sense at all. And I think, as editor-in-chief, for me, like, we think about defining Asian America, right? What does that mean? Like, it means really leaning into the politics of it. And I know that there's lots of movements to disaggregate what it means to be this Asian American and all these things. But we know that now it's, a political force, right? It's a movement.
Yeah, I think that's really cool that y'all were able to get to the heart of it. Because when I hear comments like that, like, oh, that's so political, that's more so what I experience is people taking issue with like the socialist undertones of the messaging. Again, I'm looking at this work through a pop culture lens. But, when you look at the history of our solidarity, like historic movements, historic figures that have worked across these racial lines, that's been a lot of where they drew their principles from. And to me, when I hear people say that stuff, I feel like they're trying to speak to something else that they can't express. And so they're taking issue with this thing and kind of missing the message. And, it's cool if you can get that message to them despite those misgivings they may have. But also, like you said, you kind of just have to move forward and spread the message, because the message is the most important part, right? And you meet people where they're at, where you can, and everyone else will get there eventually, hopefully. That's what we can hope.
Yeah. I think that it's political no matter what, right? Like I wrote a review on Elemental, the Pixar film, right? And it had strong undertones of the immigrant experience, right? How is that not political, right? So it's just like, it's better to be conscious than unconscious of our biases, of the harm that we can create, of, the things that we could do better.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like a lot of people want to, and for good reason, silo themselves away from these hard topics because they just want to live their lives. They don't want to have to think about how they're being oppressed systematically and in day-to-day conversations at work, all this stuff. And like, I totally feel that. I feel that draw to not want to engage with that. But fortunately or unfortunately, in America especially, to be a marginalized person does thrust you into a political existence because our whole identities have been politicized. So you can either choose to engage with it or not. But I don't think it's fair to be like, oh, that's too political. Like, that's just the soup we're swimming in, So I wanted to know what the process was like. Well, especially now that I know that y'all are a volunteer force, what the process was like of developing the column and how starting a project like that happens.
Yeah, definitely. We started under the tenure of the previous editor-in-chief. And actually, we need to shout out to our third co-editor, Tria Wen, who, was really a driving force for the creation of this column. I think we really coalesced around the idea that as an Asian American publication, we needed to say something. In 2020, we needed to say something. And I think that certain people on staff and leadership didn't know what to say. And I think that can be hard, right? Like you saw so many corporations scrambling, like pull together the message, like, but it's not about, putting together corporate messages about saying something. It's like about what should we say that will spark action? And I think that that's what really led to the creation of our column, is that we wanted to say things that would hit our readers in a certain way so that they could be like, oh, okay, I get the problem and I know what I can do better.
And it wasn't easy by any means to, even come together and agree on our mission statement, our, for lack of a better word, like manifesto, because, we're all coming from different perspectives. We're all coming from different walks of life. We're all still very much learning. And I think even agonizing over like specific words and word choice, and of course, as editors, that's what we do, right? And we're three of us are coming together and looking at the same sentence and reading it over and agonizing over, is this the right word? Is this the right term? I don't think we should use that. Let's use this instead. What do you think of this? And really brainstorming and really discussing these ideas. And that in itself felt very political, right? Because we are, actually stopping to think about the impact of a single word on not just our readers in our community, but also other communities as well, and how they're going forth into the world and sharing, our message. And I think, even if it was uncomfortable in those moments at first, or even if there continues to be moments that are uncomfortable, I think, right, it's all about leaning into that discomfort as we're learning and as we're, changing what, ideas have been hardwired into our brains by our society. And that, I think, has been a very exciting part of Black Allyship at Mochi, that place to really come together and discuss these ideas and just grow together.
How has having the column informed other work at Mochi? Like, I imagine, because you are both talking about, we've learned a lot along the way through our work as allies or co-conspirators with Black people through this column. Like, has that affected the work across Mochi? Like, has it changed the dynamics behind the scenes at all? What has that been like?
I think, like, as I mentioned, Mochi did shift a little bit under my tenure. As I also mentioned, I'm a strong activist. And this comes from a place of, I am a single mom to a disabled toddler. We were under the poverty line when I gave birth to him. I was really young. I know what it's like to be oppressed by multiple systems. I remember clearly, like, sitting in, and it's hard to talk about still because I have so much trauma from it. But, like, I remember sitting 2, maybe 3 days after giving birth, just like having like postpartum sweats, and sitting in a Medicare office trying to file for health insurance for my son, because they don't let you do it before the child is born. But trying to file for health insurance because I knew that he had Down syndrome and we needed to go to multiple doctors in the next few weeks. And I didn't want to go in without health insurance and just incur, what could have been hundreds of thousands of dollars in bills. But at the same time, I needed to go, and just navigating those systems so young and like really scared and alone, because I didn't, like, I had my mother, but I didn't have a partner in it. I didn't, have a boyfriend or his father in the picture. And I think that, that's the place that it comes from, that it's important to do this work, I think, across the board. And I think even before we talked, I was talking to you about the Black maternal health crisis and how that's really important to me, because I see how these issues, you see people go through it for their whole lives, like if you're Black in America, you live a certain life, right? Where, all these systems are creating these circumstances where it's difficult for you to live your best life. But any one of us could be oppressed by those systems at any moment and not come out of it, right? So I think that that's important to remember, is that, I think especially in disability justice, you hear this all the time, it's the one marginalized group that anybody can become a part of at any point in their lives. So I think it's really important for us at Mochi to think about, as Asian Americans, are we perpetrating tenets of white supremacy? Are we perpetrating oppression among other people of color? Are we perpetrating harm even against other Asian Americans, right? There's colorism at play. There's lots of things at play within our own communities. So that's where I come from, and that's where I think that, Mochi has changed, and that's kind of who we are now. And I say it kind of like, oh, that's kind of who we are now, because I recognize the work that our founders put into it to make this platform for teenage girls. But it's also like, platforms need to evolve. So I'm like, that's kind of how we are now, but it's also like, that's kind of how we are now.
Yeah, I really do think that it is a testament to Giannina's incredible hard work and dedication to Mochi, because she really reads every single piece that goes up. And not all EICs have the, for whatever reason, are able to do that. And Giannina is always in there and making sure that we, are aligned in our mission statement to, of course, redefine the Asian American experience, but also to be socially aware and to, make sure that we are aligned in our voice and that we're not going to say anything that is harmful to, other communities and in our own community as well. And I think that it truly is because Giannina is in there, reading the pieces and giving feedback to our writers. Of course, our writers are also on this learning journey. We all are. And, she is kind of ensuring that the message that we are working on through Black allyship at Mochi is also very present in our other pieces, whether it's entertainment or, it's a beauty piece, right? We're being very socially aware.
Thank you for sharing your story, Giannina. That I think is going to resonate with a lot of people. And I think that's what is so compelling to me and so important about this work is that, these forces constantly and also individually at any one time can be forced against us. And that in itself is a universal experience of the marginalized. And, we're constantly pitted against each other, but like we all have some story like that, like because we live under the framework of white supremacy. Like that's a traumatic experience overall, but then we're experiencing individual traumas and those inform how we move through our life from there. And I think that'll resonate with a lot of people. So I really thank you for sharing that. And I think it's also a story of hope because I think, when you experience that, especially trauma at the hands of the system, you can feel so hopeless, right? Like it's so hard. And to come through that with any sort of hope or wanting to be active after that. I know a lot of people who have had lots of trauma at the hand of the medical system, racialized trauma at that, class disparity, all of that. And a lot of people like just shut that out. So to use that as a catalyst to be like, you know what, we can make this world better, I think is very inspiring. And I would love that to be the story for more folks. And I think we have to share for that to be a thing, for people to feel less shame around their trauma, first and foremost. And also to just know what's possible. Like we can come together, we can heal together in community, through action, through conversation, through just supporting each other. And I would love to see more of that. And I think work like Black Allyship at Mochi is a great starting point because it allows people to even enter into conversations about what is oppression, like what does it look like for other people who don't look like me. And like, I think you can see your own story reflected in that. I find that true of, Asian Americans learning about Black history and like actually delving into the stories of Black people and vice versa when Black people actually open themselves up to the ideas of the Asian American plight. Because again, we are also told as Black people, there's the model minority myth. There's a lot of resentment because of like the position Asian Americans, this is very broadly, of course, it depends on the specific community, but the position they've been given in our society when Black people have been here working quite literally for generations in this country and what they've been given back. Where was my point going?
Thank you for sharing that. I think, though, that I have to say that you and Sarah both give me too much credit. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, yeah, my situation really was tough. And I think it was, a couple of years of toughness, but I am very privileged in that I got out of it, right? Like it's funny because it was like one moment of your life and then like the next moment it was okay. In that like, I found out I was pregnant right after I graduated, suddenly was like pregnant and working like 3 part-time jobs in order to pay for a house because I couldn't live with my parents and then gave birth to the baby, was really struggling, but then got accepted to grad school on a full ride, like, I think it's like, it's funny because it goes to show my privilege, right? Like, I think that there was like, it's not like, oh, it's like hopeful and like, oh, I worked hard for it and all those things. Like, I'm sure I was hopeful and I'm sure I did work hard, but I think that there was a certain level of privilege in that I finished college. I've talked to doulas who help teenagers who don't even get the chance to go to college, right? Who are in probably the same situation I was, more or less, right? So I finished college. I had that privilege to get me out of that situation. And I think for me, that's actually why it's so important that I use the privilege that I have, in work like this, right? Whether it's for Mochi as a whole or for the BAM column, the Black Allyship and Mochi column. I think it's really important that with whatever extra energy I have, and I don't have a lot of it because I'm usually chasing my 4-year-old aside from working my job and doing Mochi stuff. Like I try to put it into causes that are really important for me to not to like give back, but because like I know what it's like. And I think, there's that quote from that Aboriginal Australian researcher who says something like, if you're not walking with me, then I don't need your solidarity. That's not the exact quote, but it's something along those lines of like, if you're not walking the same struggle as I am, then, I don't actually need your help. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind because I have walked in those shoes. So I want to help those people who are going through it now because it doesn't need to happen that way.
I think two things can be true at once. I think, your story could be a story of hard work and privilege. And I think that's also something that people have a hard time learning as they go on their journey. They're like, okay, but I worked hard and I was hopeful and I did all these things. And I think it's a beautiful thing when people can come to understand that and to utilize the privilege that they have, because I had to go on my own journey being a mixed Black person. Like I have a certain level of inherent privilege that way, and learning and understanding that while like, yeah, I've had hard things happen and it's been a struggle and like it hasn't been easy, but then also I have this privilege. But once I was able to unpack all of that, it's like, oh, I have power that I can utilize to help those around me, and I should do that. I wonder if y'all have any advice for folks who are just now starting to navigate their own journeys of allyship, whether that's Asian folks trying to be allies to Black people or vice versa, or just in general.
I think just starting with, education and really, there's so many wonderful resources out there covering the history of Asian Americans and Black Americans and everyone in between, and how all of our communities have come together in the past or have been pitted against each other in the past. I think really just educating ourselves and recognizing that, there is this shared history and that there continues to be shared history and nothing happens in a vacuum. I think that's the first step to, starting this journey of, racial solidarity and recognizing that it's okay to mess up. And as you noted before, right, it's okay to say the wrong thing as long as, you are willing to learn from that and take accountability and grow from that. And I think that that's something that I personally struggle with because I'm just an anxious person in general. And
relatable.
Sometimes I, think maybe there's no place for my voice in this. Right. And that also comes from like a child of immigrants perspective where I was always taught like, right, like what is the expression? Don't be seen, don't be heard, or
seen but not heard.
Seen but not heard. Yes, thank you. Well, for me it was don't be seen and don't be heard, but
oh no.
But that kind of mentality of my parents didn't speak English very well growing up, and thinking about how they very much trusted teachers and other figures of authority to just kind of help me navigate the world. And now we know that, those figures of authority may not have been the right people to trust.
Yeah.
And just kind of growing from that, recognizing that there were things that we learned when we were younger that we have to unlearn. And it's a very uncomfortable process to unlearn those things. And, it really is just a matter of taking it slow, and so you don't burn yourself out, but also, making sure that you are not just learning, but also taking action items and, writing to your politicians, attending rallies, writing if you have social anxiety and you can't go out there to rally, using your whatever you have the power to do to help.
Do you have anything to add, Giannina?
I don't think I have the expertise to give advice to all people, right? About what they could do better. I think, I want to encourage my fellow Asian Americans to not subscribe to white ideals, right? And think about, different ways of raising our children, raising the next generation that don't adhere to these notions or definitions of success that have been defined for centuries by, white people. I think for me, staying out of predominantly white spaces is one of those things that can really help expose, your child to these things from a young age and like can build better people. And I think that you can find that when children are in diverse spaces, that they can teach you things, that they can be like, hey, mom, like, I see this all the time with my son who goes to an inclusive preschool, right? He's one of the only few kids with a disability, and it's a strongly visible disability. He's not verbal yet, but he has friends, and I'm sure that they tell their parents about Cato and what they like about him. And then it's funny because when they meet him, they're like, oh, he has Down syndrome, it changes things for them, right? And I know like Asian parents out there are going to hate me, but like not pushing Ivy schools, not pushing private schools, like public schools, like all those things that could be really helpful for us to learn about one another, to connect with one another, to find like joy and happiness in outside of capitalist constructs. I think that that's really important for Asian Americans. And I think that that's the way that we build solidarity. And, Rohan wrote about this on a piece for Mochi, but it's also something that I believe deeply is that in order to move forward in this work, you have to know yourself, right? I think as a high schooler, I didn't know myself. I subscribed to white ideals. I wanted to be blonde. I wanted to have blue eyes. I wished I was a white kid. And it's so painful to say now because it's like, why would I want to be anybody but myself? Because I'm amazing, but it's like back then that was the reality is I wanted to be someone who I was not because society holds this certain ideal, above us. And because I was holding that ideal in my mind, even I did things that were harmful, right? That I shouldn't have done. And looking back on it, I'm like, yeah, why did I do that? Oh, because I was subscribing to white ideals in a predominantly white space. I think getting out of those spaces can really help, Asian Americans and other people of color to find allegiance with one another. And I guess for white people, like, I think you also need to find yourself, but I can't tell you how to do that.
Yeah. Rohan mentioned that in our episode about you need to find yourself as far as like where to start with activist work. But I think allyship in general, like you have to know where you're coming from, your background. That includes the harm that you've done. And I think hard to accept, but I want to give people, I hope through the course of this podcast, the freedom to accept that we've all perpetuated white supremacy. Like that's the structure. It is literally indoctrinating you to further the system. Even me as a mixed Black person, even Black people, LGBTQIA people, like we are all susceptible to doing it. And even after you learn and you start to do better, you're going to slip up and it's going to happen. And giving yourself freedom to recognize that and recognize that the fact that you have these instincts to do that aren't your fault is a great step because then you can go, okay, but what is in my control is how I respond, what my second thought is after my first thought, like these types of things I think is really important. So I think that's great advice to Asian Americans, but I think, anyone trying to do this work in general, it's a great place to start. The column has been going now for 3 years, 3 years. What is time? I know calendars. Hello.
Well, time after the pandemic doesn't count anymore, right?
I know,
right?
It's
like not a thing.
It's not a real thing. That's wild. It's been 3 years. That's why my brain stuttered a little bit. I was like, 3 years, really? Okay, cool. You've covered a lot of topics. You've had a lot of great guest contributors. I'm curious, what are some topics you would love to see covered by the column in future that maybe you've only brushed on or things you want to see dive deeper into?
I mean, something that I actually messaged Giannina about this the other day, right? There's always something happening in the news that I wish we had the capacity to cover, to, really like write a full in-depth article about something that's happening right now that we can, publish really quickly. We can edit it. We can, get like a great picture for it and throw it up and, get our readers active, and have a very specific, like, there's this, rally here, let's go. And that's something that, as we are volunteers, has been a struggle, right? Because we, of course, have to subscribe by capitalism and work day jobs to pay the bills.
Yeah.
But that is something that I personally would just love if we could do, if we had the capacity to like really write fast news articles about current events that wouldn't put a strain on, our staff who are already working so hard. That's just kind of the general term, but as an example, right? There's so much happening with ethnic studies in the news that we have not really gotten a chance to cover in detail. And there's a lot going on between the Asian American community and Black community where, right, we all want to pass ethnic studies, but some groups are maybe trying to get these bills passed at, all costs and working with maybe not so ideal politicians in order to get that done, but really stressing that, we want more inclusivity and solidarity when thinking about these action items. And this is just one topic, right? But so many that I would just love for us to have the capacity to cover.
Sarah, I think you and I were thinking the same thing because I was going to jump into that too. So we are definitely aligned on these things. I think definitely, the passage of Asian American studies in certain states, which we shall pretend are not part of the United States anymore. Just kidding, we can't. We can't turn a blind eye to it. We need to think deeply about, what's happening in Florida, not just for Asian Americans, Black folks, and, people of color, but also for transgender folks. Right? Like we see so many bills across the nation. And I think that that's the one thing for me. It's really important to not just think about racial justice. It's important to think about, gender justice. It's important to think about disability justice, all these frameworks that come together. Because I think sometimes, as you see with these groups that Sarah is mentioning, when you push your agenda by yourself in a silo, you end up hurting other people. Right? And you might be like, oh, no, I'm really just trying to help my own people. Don't worry. You actually end up hurting other people. So I think that that's really important that we aren't working in silos. We're working together in coalition with one another so that, when we push these things forward, it's not like, African American studies is banned and Asian American studies is now, legislated. Like, in what world does that make sense? When African American studies is like rooted in the core of American history, right? There would be no United States without, the Black people who were, taken from their home countries and put here to like labor for free. Like, I think that that's really important for us to remember, right? And it's important to remember that there are parallels in Asian American history, right? So are they not in Asian American history going to talk about the Chinese people who built the railroads, right? Because they're like, we don't want, people of color to be mad at white folks. And that's like their reasoning behind like, oh, let's ban, African American studies. It's like, so you're not going to talk about that in Asian American studies? You're not going to talk about the ways that Asian Americans have been oppressed by the system. So what kinds of Asian American studies are you, covering? Right? Like, that's the question. I think that for me, that's like a big thing that I really want us to investigate is like, what kinds of Asian American studies are you teaching? Are you going to teach them about foods that I like to eat? Because that's not Asian American studies. Like, that's great cultural exposure, but you could go eat dim sum, whenever.
Right.
I'm making light of it, but it's such a serious thing, right? It's not just about acceptance or inclusion, or I even saw this word. It was like, what was it? And it made me kind of mad. It was like tolerance. They were like, we need to teach tolerance. And now I'm down my spiral. So please pull me back.
So a few things. I find it helpful to laugh because you can't just be in the doom and gloom. So you got to laugh sometimes because what else are you going to do? So I think it's fine to not make light of it, but you got to get the jokes off as well as talk about the serious issues, I'm from Texas originally. So
I'm kidding.
I'm not. It's pretty bad down there too. And so like I am a big advocate for remembering, that trans people exist in the South, Black people exist in the South. Like these are these people's homes. And so really having to engage with the hard stuff that's happening in these places and having people who are having thoughtful conversations is so important. But at the same time, actually, I think, Giannina, it was your automatic reply on your email. It says something about how urgency is a construct of white supremacy. And that blew my mind. I had never thought of that. Like, capitalism, yeah, but just to think of it in those terms, I'm like, that is so true. Like, why who said that everything has to happen now? Because I feel that pressure a little bit as a podcaster, nowhere near as much as I would as print media, as a digital magazine. Like, that pressure is very real for y'all. But why don't we value more so thoughtful conversations, which take time to develop? Like, I would love to hear y'all's and your contributors' thoughts on the stuff that's happening in Florida. And I don't see why it's not allowed to take time. It's fine that it would take time to develop that thoughtful conversation and that thoughtful perspective that I think your readers and I would be very excited to hear, even if it's, a month or two from now, because it's also an intersection of solidarity in the fact that, yeah, you're teaching a whitewashed Asian American history and not teaching Black history, but it's even more whitewashed than that, because I don't know that people realize just how intertwined our histories are. You really, to teach Asian American history, there comes a point in the narrative that you also have to teach Black history, because they interweave so much for a time period that it's wild to me to even suggest. I mean, it's not wild because it's Ron DeSantis, but
he who shall not be named.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, normal people would know that that's a wild thing to suggest. So I hope that pressure, it gets relieved over time. It probably won't. I know it's a constant balance, but I hope that you at least have one reader who is like, we will wait for it,
I think our readers, when we have the time, capacity, and energy to put thought to it, will appreciate what we put out. I think I should also note proper citation. I don't believe in not properly citating. Citating is not a word, but citing. This idea of like urgency and white supremacy is not mine. It's actually a really famous scholar, Tema Okun's idea. And there are several tenets of white supremacy that you'd be surprised by, actually. So I think for me, it's actually really hard to work against urgency, because I was raised to be a workaholic. I probably also just have it in my blood, But you want to get things done, and you think that what you accomplish is indicative of you being successful and thus you being a valuable human being. But what you create in this world, it could take a long time. We know that, for instance, authors, some of my favorite authors, wrote their books for 10 years, right? And it's not indicative of their day-to-day value. I think that that's, again, bringing it back to connectivity, like why it's important to connect with one another on a relational basis. Just because I think that, especially when I'm in the disability justice framework, what you can achieve shouldn't be who you are or how you're valued for, right? Like, I value my child because he's my child, and I think he's such a joy. And it's funny because I know other parents think about like, oh, what kinds of jobs will they do? And it's like, I'm not thinking about what kind of jobs they'll do, how he'll be part of the system. I'm trying to see how he's going to break through the system. What can he do that is beyond capitalism, because he doesn't need to be part of the system, right? That's the interesting thing, is like within all these spaces, there's spaces to disrupt norms, right? There's spaces to move beyond the systems. And I think it's rare, but you got to find it. And now I'm continuing on this tangent, but I'm going to stop myself.
Did you have anything to add to that, Sarah?
Actually, my partner and I often talk about this, and I realize I have to unlearn a lot of the things that my parents instilled in me, right? That like, because you're Asian American, you have to be 2 times smarter than, everyone else in that room. You have to work 2 times harder than everyone else in that room. And it's something that I just have to unlearn. And my partner is Puerto Rican, and we have the privilege of living in New York City, where, I mean, there's a housing crisis, so I don't know how much longer we can live in New York City, but we're born and raised here. So we have seen diversity all around us, but we're also seeing this insane schooling system in New York City that once again pits Asian communities against many other people of color and children of color. And like that's a horrible thing for kids to have to navigate. And these are conversations that we have often of how do we break through this? How do we give our kids the tools for surviving in the world in a capitalist society while also teaching them to dismantle these beliefs? So it's definitely something that we grapple with, and we shall see.
It's an answer we're always, all of us, constantly writing, right? What are the solutions? How will we combat and beat these oppressive forces. But I think it's kind of beautiful that we're all finding the answer together continuously. And if you ever feel hopeless in the pursuit of that, I think that's something that gives me hope, is knowing that there are things like Black Allyship at Mochi. There are people like Rohan. There are places in fandom like with Grace doing work together to build coalition. And I think you can find a lot of hope in that, even when in your personal life you're like, this is really hard. And that can really help you continue on the path. With that said, what are y'all's hopes for the future of BAM? I feel like I'm so cool. I'm using that. The short version of BAM.
Yeah. I think, hearing from readers and potentially seeing their journeys, I think this also answers your previous question, is something that I would like us to start to, document and hear and like be able to share with our readers. Because I think we have had guest contributors, and a lot of the pieces, though, have been written by Sarah, Tria, and myself. And, we're very conscious of our journey, and I think we've shared it a lot. But I think it'd be interesting to hear from other people, what their journeys are. And I think, for instance, like one guest contributor, and Sarah, you'll know her name because she's your friend, but she wrote about like the Indo-Caribbean experience, right?
Yeah,
and I think that within the Asian American experience, there are many ways for us to come to consciousness about what we need to do about the society around us. And, it can be in little and slow ways. And I think that I'm not trying to fault anybody who doesn't see the issue, because I think that, like Sarah said, that they're surviving.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you have a very privileged perspective if you're like, everybody should be on board and everybody can get on board and it's easy, because it's not easy. It's hard. And it has to be something that you have the space and time and energy to contribute yourself to. And I think that, if it doesn't come for you now, it can come for you later in life. And I know this because I've had lots of talks with my mom about how she understands race as an immigrant, right? Like, she immigrated from the Philippines, and what it means to her as she grew older, because she was already an adult when she immigrated, and got to know people and understood like they have issues, right? So I don't think that it's fair to say that like everyone should be doing this now, right? Like, I think that you need to have the right space and time, and that if you're surviving right now, that's okay.
Yeah. I think my hope is that we can reach more people who are trying to survive. And sometimes reading a block of text, right, is not necessarily accessible for everyone. Maybe they're coming from their own traumas, and maybe a visual is easier. So I think we are definitely hoping to have more of a multimedia reach, exploring different avenues for sharing BAM's message and connecting with different people in ways that can feel more accessible, in a way that it's not, we're not coming from a place of judgment. We're not coming from a place of, again, you have to do this. It all comes from a place of love. It truly does. And it's a message of love that we have had the privilege to read, other racial educators share, and that we also want to help spread.
You said this is a message of love. And that was something else I was going to say when I said I grew up in Texas. We read, it's super famous, so people are going to definitely let me know what it is. But we required reading, I think, my sophomore year English class was talking about some famous white writer, I don't remember, wrote about how the world needs tolerance, not love. And I remember it was an English class, but it was kind of taught with the eye of, we don't have to love each other. We just have to tolerate each other. That's the answer to society's ills. And I grew up and realized, okay, that's a load of baloney. That's wild that, they tried to teach us that. Like, that's so wild to me. And so to juxtapose, we were talking about earlier, them wanting to teach tolerance, to you saying that it's a message of love. Like, I 100% agree that we need to come from a place of love, because that's what humanity is. I feel like our capacity to love each other and grow with each other and find community with each other. For the folks at home, if they wanted to get involved, how can they go about doing that?
Come to our website. We are always looking for guest writers, staff writers. Pitch your stories, pitch your ideas. we're truly looking for different perspectives to learn from and to help spread the message. So yeah, please come to our website and email
Black Allyship at mochimag.com, and you'll get a response from either me or Sarah, because again, we're volunteers. So it really literally will be me or Sarah. Again, not subscribing to urgency, you can expect a response between 4 to 6 weeks. Just need to
Love
say
it.
that, because I know some people are like, oh, they didn't email me back right away within 24 hours. Yeah, we don't email people back that fast. I think the other thing I would say, though, is that in order for us to share our work, I think it's really important that, if you see us and you are like, oh, I want to share this on social with, my family or friends, tag us so that people know where it's from, and then they can look at everything else that we've worked on. I think that that's, really important. Again, proper citations really important for me, and it's helpful for Mochi.
For sure. Definitely share their work. They do great pieces, even outside of the BAM column. So if there's listeners who have background or experiences, submit for wherever you feel you fit. But I for sure encourage people to do that. Again, I had Rohan as a guest. I don't know, are they just a frequent guest contributor or staff writer? I'm
Rohan
not sure.
is a dear friend. So I feel like whenever they are like, hey, I'm thinking of writing something, it's like, yeah, let's work on it together. Let me know how I can help you. So Rohan's a dear friend. They are also learning and growing in their journey. And I appreciate that, right? Because I think
For sure.
It's great to work with people who are like, I am an expert. Good for you. You're an expert, right? But I think, where we're at, it's nice to have somebody to bounce ideas off of. And actually, we're going to be judging our essay contest together this week. So I'm excited to, hear their perspective. And they come from such a different perspective. And I appreciate that.
For sure. So if y'all liked Rohan's episode, liked what they had to say, definitely go check out their articles for BAM. I'll probably link a few in the show notes, but in general, you can just go to Mochi Mag and you'll find all that and more. Before we close out, is there anything you wish we had more time for?
Oh, man. I mean, I know you wanted to talk to us about, Black and Asian, solidarities, work, movements, and stuff like that. I don't think that I can necessarily talk to the other side of that experience. So today, you've heard us talk a lot about our experience as Asian Americans and, what we've learned. And I think that that's important to know, right? I think that it's important that even if you're if I was to call myself a racial justice educator or expert, that I wouldn't be doing that alone, because it doesn't make sense to me for me to be talking about racism when I don't understand or experience anti-Black racism, and in fact can perpetrate it on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's really important for listeners to know who they are and recognize, I wouldn't say their limits, but recognize what their purview is, what they bring to the table, and being okay with that.
I think that's important. And then I'll pass it to you, Sarah. That's important for people who grew up like me. If you were, that bookish kid that everybody, the GT kid, really, who you then grow up with the trauma of oh, I have to be the best at everything and smart at everything and know everything about everything. That's a good thing to highlight, that it's okay to just highlight what you bring to the table and know what you don't. And that's fine. You're not going to be an expert in everything. You can't speak to everything. And it's important that you can't speak to everything, because there are other people who can and will do it better. So for people who grew up like me, I think that's very much important to highlight and recognize in yourself. And again, that goes to knowing yourself for sure.
Yeah. And for me, I think coming from an immigrant family background as well, and being the person who translates for my parents, not just linguistically, but also culturally, I definitely hope that our Asian Americans who have that ability to speak to their parents in a different language, to translate for them, people who are bilingual, trilingual, will really take advantage of that and, help educate our older community members about police brutality, about, the anti-Asian hate crimes, and, how increased policing will not fix these things, right? And having these conversations with our parents, with our, older generations, or even recent immigrants, right? I think that's so important. And that's something that I hope BAM can help provide resources for. because I think that really is something that is very much in conversation, very much relevant now. Here in New York as well, right? We have hate crimes every day. And that's something that is, again, pitting different communities against each other in the news. And that's a narrative that we really want to combat. And I think those of us who can speak to older generations about these things, who are able to do that, not all of us are, and that's okay. Maybe not all of us feel safe to do so, but those of us who can, I think really, it's definitely within our power to try and to help bridge that gap.
Yeah, if you feel safe to do so and you can do that work alone is so powerful. That person-to-person interpersonal communication, because, a lot of people don't have access to have those conversations, and you can do it within your own family. Well, thank you both so much for joining me. It's been a really good time, really insightful. Love everything that y'all had to say. You already told people how they can get involved, but if you could go ahead and tell the good folks in general where they can find you all, Mochi, your work, and what y'all have coming up.
Yeah, definitely. You can find us online at our website, which has been mentioned many times, at www.mochimag.com. And you can find us on Instagram at mochimagofficial and other social media platforms. But I would say Instagram is our main platform at this moment.
Like we mentioned before, not all of our pieces are inherently political. So, if you're interested, check out our other columns as well. We talk about a lot of other very pressing social issues that affect all communities. Even Giannina's wonderful review of Elemental, check it out. And yeah, definitely give us your feedback, pitch to us, follow us, and we hope to have you join our community.
Great. I love it. And thank you all so much for joining me on this Coalition mini-series. I had so much fun planning it and speaking with our guests. This was a bit of a test run, but I'm very excited to put more things like it together in the future. Let me know what you think. Did you enjoy it? Did you learn some things? Whatever the case may be. Of course, as always, you can let me know at CultureX Podcast on Twitter. Again, less so these days, or IG. And until next time, keep it chill and keep it nerdy.